Banker leaves a stack of cash on the table. But what the gardener did left him in tears. On the morning Winston Sterling showed up in the garden carrying those bills, he already knew something inside him had broken for good. He wasn't the kind of man who cried. Never had been. In 30 years working behind the scenes of the financial industry in the city of Indianapolis, he had learned that showing emotion was the same as showing weakness, and weakness, in the world he lived in, was an invitation to be eaten alive. So he had learned to hold everything in, every ache, every fear, every moment of doubt. He held it all behind that closed-off face of a man used to making tough decisions without flinching. But that Tuesday morning, with the sun still low and heavy dew on the garden leaves, Winston set the stacks of $100 bills on the stone table near the trimmed hedge, sat down in the iron chair, and covered his face with his hands. Mitchell Crawford was on the other side of the garden, raking the leaves that had fallen overnight. Green coveralls, straps crossed over his t-shirt, straw hat on his head. 12 years taking care of that garden. 12 years arriving at 7 in the morning, leaving at 4 in the afternoon without missing a single day he hadn't given notice for. 12 years seeing that house from the inside and the outside. When he turned and saw Winston sitting there, he felt something tighten in his chest, because in 12 years he had never seen that man sit down without waiting for someone, without being on the phone, without staring at some piece of paper. Winston Sterling didn't know how to stay still. Mitchell leaned the rake against the wall and walked slowly toward the table. "Mr. Winston?" His voice came out low, almost careful. "Are you okay?" Winston took his hands away from his face. His eyes were dry, still, but red, the way they get when someone has gone the whole night without real sleep. He looked at Mitchell with the expression of a man carrying a weight that no longer fit inside his own body. "Come sit with me a moment, Mitchell." That had never happened either. In 12 years, Winston had never asked the gardener to sit near him. Mitchell pulled the chair carefully, as if afraid of making too much noise, and sat down. Winston looked at the bills on the table. There were several bundles held together with rubber bands, more money than Mitchell earned in 6 months. The man in the navy blue suit, with his neatly combed grey hair and slightly loosened tie, looked out of place there that morning, as if he had shown up in the wrong scene of his own life. "I needed to talk to you in person," Winston began, with the voice he used when he was forcing himself to stay in control. "The house is going to be sold, probably within the next few weeks. I can't afford to keep any of this anymore." Mitchell stayed quiet, waited. "This money here is what I owe you, plus a severance package I consider fair for the time you've worked. You've always done everything right, Mitchell. I never had anything to complain about. I need to take a moment to breathe here, because there's something about this scene. A man who spends his whole life accumulating, building, controlling, and suddenly he's sitting in a garden trying to say goodbye to all of it at once. That tightens in a way that's hard to explain." Mitchell looked at the bills, looked at Winston, and didn't reach for them. "Can you tell me what happened?" Winston wasn't expecting that. He was expecting Mitchell to thank him, take the money, and leave like everyone else had left in the past few days. But Mitchell stayed right there, his arms resting on his knees, looking at him with that calm attention of someone who had the time and the willingness to listen. And Winston told him about Lawrence Garrison, his partner of nearly 20 years. He told her about the company the two of them had built together, a wealth management firm that served high-profile families across an entire region. He told her how, over the last 6 months, something had started to look wrong in the numbers, how he had requested an internal audit and the results had come back distorted, how he had discovered, by accident, through a secretary who couldn't keep the secret any longer, that Lawrence had been moving client funds into side accounts for at least 2 years. When the story came to light, Lawrence had his narrative ready. He said Winston was the one who knew everything, that Winston was the one responsible, that the documents proving the transactions bore Winston's signature, a signature Winston knew was forged, but it was there, perfect, and very difficult to contest without a long and costly legal battle. The clients withdrew what funds remained. The business partners backed away. The reputation Winston had built over 30 years began to crumble within weeks, like a poorly built house on waterlogged ground. "And Bridget?" Mitchell asked. Winston closed his eyes for a second. Bridget was his daughter, 28 years old, working as a legal assistant at a law firm downtown. The same Bridget who had grown up watching her father come home late, leave early, cancel vacation trips, miss school plays because of meetings. The same Bridget who had learned early on that her father loved his work more than anything else. "She believes what Lawrence is saying," Winston replied. Flat, like someone swallowing a lump. "She believes you did it?" "She says she doesn't know what to believe, that she needs proof, that until she has proof she can't take sides." He let out a bitter laugh, short, with nothing joyful in it, after 28 years of being her father. Mitchell stared at the garden for a moment, at the neatly trimmed hedges, at the dark green lawn, at the beds of bromeliads he himself had planted there about 3 years back. "I have something to show you," he said, in a different voice. Firmer. Winston looked at him. "But first, you need to answer something for me." Mitchell turned to him slowly. "Do you remember that, about 4 years ago, you asked me to leave the back gate of the garden unlocked on Friday afternoons, because Mr. Lawrence was going to have meetings back there?" Winston thought. The memory came from far away, hazy, almost dissolved. "I vaguely remember. He said he liked outdoor meetings." "Right," Mitchell nodded slowly. "I left the gate open on Fridays, but I kept working until the end of my shift even when they asked me to leave early, because I'm stubborn like that." A faint hint of a smile, discreet. "And because I always thought those meetings were strange." Winston stood still. "I have a notebook. I've had it from the start. I wrote down the dates, the times, the people I saw arriving, the cars, what I overheard without meaning to. I didn't understand everything. That's not my field. But I wrote it all down just the way I heard it. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The silence that fell between the two of them lasted a few seconds, that felt like much longer. "Mitchell," Winston began, and his voice didn't come out whole. "I never once stepped into that meeting room, but the back garden has a little window right next to the pergola. I heard the names. I heard when someone talked about accounts. Once I heard Mr. Lawrence say that if they needed to, they'd use the signatures they already had." Mitchell paused. "I didn't know what that meant at the time, but I wrote it down." Winston slowly rose from his chair. He stood, his back to Mitchell, looking out at the garden. His shoulders rose and fell once, heavy, like someone letting out air that had been trapped for too long. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "I tried once. Do you remember? It was a Monday morning, about 2 years ago. You rushed in here talking on the phone, and I started to say I wanted to talk about some things I'd seen. You said, 'Later, Mitchell, not now,' and you left." Winston stood still. Yes, Winston Sterling remembered. Not the conversation itself, but he remembered the habit, the later, the not now. 30 years of not now said to everyone close to him, whoever it was. There are things you hear and recognize in an uncomfortable way, because you know you've done the same thing, said later to someone who needed it to be now, and there's no undoing that later. "Is the notebook here with you?" Winston asked, still with his back turned. "No, it's at my house, but I can bring it today if you want." "I do." Winston turned. "Mitchell, this notebook might be the only thing that—" "I know." The gardener stood up as well, about 2 inches taller than Winston, with dark, calm eyes, like someone who had made a decision before even being asked. "That's why I kept it." Winston looked at the bills on the table. That money he had arrived determined to hand over as a farewell, as if he could buy peace of conscience by dismissing an honest man without losing any more of himself. "You don't want the money." "I want what I'm entitled to," Mitchell replied, "but that's not what I came here for today." Winston didn't answer, because he didn't know what to say. And for a man who had always known exactly what to say in any situation, that silence had an almost physical weight. Mitchell walked back to where he had left the rake, leaning against the wall. He picked it up with both hands and stood still for a moment, turned to the side as if he were about to leave and then thought better of it. "Mrs. Vivian gave me something before she left," he said, without turning around. 8 years ago now. The air around Winston seemed to change temperature. Vivian, the name he hadn't heard spoken by anyone outside his own head in a long time. Vivian Sterling, or Vivian Holloway, as she had gone back to calling herself after the separation. The woman he had been married to for 22 years. The woman who had woken up one morning and said she couldn't live next to an empty chair anymore, because Winston was always somewhere else even when he was there. He had let her go, not because he didn't love her, but because at the time he had believed that love alone wasn't enough when there was still so much to build, and that there would be time later. There would always be time later. "What did she give you?" Winston's voice came out smaller than he intended. Mitchell turned slowly. He reached into the wide pocket of his overalls and pulled out a folded envelope, yellowed at the edges, with the name Winston written by hand on the front. The handwriting was Vivian's, unmistakable with that large sweeping W she had always made since the days she was earning her teaching degree in a small town in the Appalachians. "She told me to keep it until the day you stopped running, that I would know when it was time." Winston walked slowly toward Mitchell. He reached out and took the envelope carefully, as if afraid the paper would vanish. 12 years, he said quietly. "You kept this for 12 years. 8. She gave it to me when she left. 8 years. Mitchell had carried that envelope the whole time, waiting for the moment that Vivian had predicted with a precision that only people who truly know someone from the inside out are capable of having. I keep thinking about Vivian writing that letter, without knowing when it would be read. How do you choose your words when you don't know the state the person will be in on the other side? I think only someone who has truly loved could write like that." Winston returned to the chair. He sat down and opened the envelope carefully, as if opening it quickly would be disrespectful to the time it had waited. The letter had 3 pages. Firm handwriting, no erasures, like someone who wrote knowing exactly what they wanted to say. Winston read slowly, and Mitchell didn't leave. He stayed as he was, rake in hand, looking at the garden, giving space without disappearing. When Winston finished the last line, he folded the pages carefully, put them back in the envelope and stared ahead, at the quiet green of that garden that remained there, unchanged, as if the world hadn't fallen apart. His eyes were full. Not the sadness of someone who lost money or reputation. It was something else. It was the hardest sadness to carry, the one of someone who understood too late what was important, but understood for real, with no escape, with no way to pretend they didn't know. The tears fell slowly. He didn't try to hold them back. Mitchell glanced at him sideways, said nothing, didn't approach. Sometimes respecting someone's pain is exactly that, staying close without intruding. After a time that had no right size, Winston wiped his face with his jacket sleeve and took a deep breath. One of those breaths that are almost a decision. "Vivian wrote well," he said, with a voice that still trembled at the edges, almost a smile. "She was a teacher before she met you," Mitchell replied. "She was." A pause. "You knew a lot about my life, Mitchell." "I worked here 12 years, Mr. Winston. You learn." Winston looked at him with a different expression, like someone seeing another person for the first time after years of looking without really seeing. "I never asked about your life," he said, not as an accusation, as honest recognition the way it hurts. "You never asked," Mitchell confirmed without apparent resentment. "But that's okay. There are people who ask and don't really listen. You at least paid me right and never treated me badly. That's not enough. It isn't. But it's more than a lot of people do." There was a quiet dignity in that man that Winston, for the first time, fully saw. Mitchell Crawford was 42 years old, father of 3 children, had a wife named Brenda who worked as a nursing assistant at a neighborhood public health clinic. He had finished high school late, already an adult, at an adult education center, because during the day he'd had to work since he was 16 to help his family. He hadn't gone to college, but he had an observational intelligence that Winston, with all his years of study and career, had never cultivated in himself. Of course, Winston didn't know any of that yet. He would discover it little by little, in the weeks that followed, in the mornings when the two of them had coffee while the garden woke up. That morning, what he knew was that a man he had treated as part of the scenery of his own life for 12 years had kept a notebook with information that could change the course of everything, had kept a letter that the woman he loved asked to be delivered at the right moment, and had refused a stack of money to sit by his side and simply listen. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. In the days that followed, Mitchell's notebook was handed over to the lawyer Winston hired, a cautious, experienced man who worked for weeks, cross-referencing the dates and names written by hand with formal transaction records. What Mitchell had written wasn't enough proof on its own, but it was the thread. And when you pull the right thread, the whole ball comes with it. Mrs. Martha, the housekeeper who was 68 years old and had worked for the family longer than Mitchell himself, also spoke. She had seen things. She had overheard conversations Lawrence had held in the hallway of the house, back when he still showed up there as a partner and close friend. She had kept quiet because no one had asked, and because, as she herself told the lawyer, with the frankness of someone who no longer has the time or patience for half measures, a man who acts like he owns the place never wants to hear what we in the kitchen have to say. Mrs. Martha had the sharp memory of someone who spends her life paying attention to others, while others pay no attention to her. She remembered dates, times, names she had heard in fragments and stored away without knowing why. Sometimes we hold on to what we don't understand because something deep inside tells us to keep it. Her information and Mitchell's, taken together, began to build a picture that Lawrence Garrison had calculated would never come together. The lawsuit dragged on. Longer than Winston would have liked. There were weeks when nothing seemed to move forward, when the lawyer called with bad news, and Winston listened while sitting on the balcony of the small apartment he had rented on a quiet street near the historic district, looking down at the cobblestone road below, trying to remember why it was still worth fighting. And there were days when he remembered easily. Those were the days Bridget showed up. Bridget took her time. That's the kind of thing that hurts in a special way, when it's your own daughter who needs more time to believe in you than anyone else. She came around, first for a difficult conversation, which took place in the small kitchen of the new apartment, with both of them standing because there weren't enough chairs yet, saying things that had been stored away for years, without kindness, without filters, without the polite varnish families sometimes spread over their wounds. Bridget said she felt she had spent her childhood waiting for her father, that every time he cancelled something, she understood the message, even if he had never said it in words, that when the whole story with Lawrence came to light, a small and shameful part of her thought, maybe he really did do it, because a man capable of trading his presence for business might be capable of other trades too. Winston listened to all of it without defending himself, because there was no defense. There was only her truth, which was as real as his own. "I was wrong," he said when she finished. "Not about what Lawrence is saying, but about other things, Bridget. Things I'm not even sure can be fixed." "Maybe they can't," she replied, "but I want to know if you're going to try." That was the beginning, not of a quick and tidy reconciliation, but of something more honest than that, of two people learning, with difficulty and with setbacks, to truly talk to each other. Lawrence Garrison was confronted with the cross-referenced records. First he denied everything. Then he denied part of it. Then, when he realized the weight of the evidence was greater than he had calculated, the version he had built, the version where Winston was the guilty one, began to crack in places he could no longer patch up. It wasn't a dramatic ending, the kind you imagine. There was no single moment where everything resolved all at once. It was slow, exhausting, full of back and forth, but it did get resolved. Gradually, the way real things usually do. Part of what had been lost never came back. The big house was sold, not out of desperate necessity, but because Winston realized as he walked through the empty rooms waiting for the buyers that he didn't need all of that, that enormous house was less of a home than a trophy, and that he had been feeding the trophy while letting other things wither without noticing. The new apartment was smaller. The wealth management firm he rebuilt from scratch was smaller, more careful, with fewer clients and more attention to each one. He stopped working on weekends. He started answering the phone when Bridget called, even in the middle of a meeting. And Mitchell? Mitchell got what was his, yes. Winston insisted, not as a farewell, but as recognition of everything that had gone unsaid in 12 years together. But beyond that, when Winston signed the lease on the apartment with the tiny little balcony and the backyard garden, it was Mitchell who went over to see what needed looking after. A small garden, nothing compared to the one before. A few large pots, a climbing vine in the back, a narrow bed of herbs that Mrs. Martha had asked him to plant because she liked cooking with fresh mint, but green and alive. And on Tuesday mornings, sometimes, the two of them would have coffee together before starting the day. Mitchell with his straw hat resting on the chair beside him and his big hands wrapped around the mug. Winston with his jacket hung over the back of the chair, his tie loose since early, like a man who was learning he didn't need the armor as much. It wasn't just boss and employee anymore, it was something harder to name and easier to feel. Two men who had gone through something together and come out the other side different from who they'd been when they went in. One day, after they'd been having these coffees for a while, Winston asked Mitchell if he knew what was inside Vivian's letter. Mitchell said he didn't, that he'd kept it unopened the way she'd asked, that the only thing Vivian had said was that, keep it until the right day and he would know when it was time. Winston was quiet for a moment, looking at his cup. Then he said Vivian had written about the garden, that she said a man who never stops running never sees what's growing right beside him, and that when the day came that he finally stopped, truly stopped, he'd look around and see that the people who had cared for that garden with love were the same ones he had barely looked in the eye in all those years. Mitchell didn't answer right away. He stayed looking at the plants for a moment, with that expression of his, like someone thinking deeper than words can reach. Then he got up, picked up his mug, and went out to the garden. He crouched by Mrs. Martha's bed, worked the soil with 2 fingers the way he always did, to see if it was damp or dry. And Winston stood watching him, truly watching this time, without a phone in his hand, without a report waiting, without the rush to be somewhere more important, with a smile that took too long to come, but it came. The end. There are stories you finish telling and need to sit with for a while before you leave. This one was like that for me. A man who spent his life building and accumulated everything except attention for what was close. A gardener who, with the simplicity of someone who simply observed the world around him, kept what needed to be kept and waited for the right time without asking anything in return. And a woman who knew the man she loved so well that she knew when he would finally be ready to listen. This touched me deeply, and I hope it touched you too. Tell us what you thought, where you're watching from, what you felt, whether you've been through something similar. The comments are yours, and I read them with great care. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you so much for your company today.